Hey folks, it's Eric again. Thanks again for joining us this week. For those of you who haven't been with us before, I'm the curator here at Seven Oaks House Museum, and right now we're standing in the parlor of the oldest home in Winnipeg. This place is, really steeped in history. It's so rich here. This house was owned by the Inkster family. They settled here back in the 1830s, but this part was built back in 1851. So it's a tremendously old place, and they lived here for almost 100 years, and they left behind a lot of artifacts and relics that tell us a lot about the family's history, but also about the history and the story of our community here in Winnipeg. At the time, it was called the Red River Settlement. Long before it was a city, it was a little trading post, basically, that sprung up around the forks and kind of developed from there. But families like the Inksters played such an important role in the development of our community, and without people like this, we very much wouldn't be where we are today. We owe them a lot for our history and for our shared culture here. And the Inksters were a family with Scottish and Cree ancestry, so they wouldn't have thought of themselves this way necessarily at the time, but today we would understand them as a Métis family. And so in some ways you see this kind of wealthy Victorian European tradition, but the women in the family, we've learned, did this really amazing job of preserving their family traditions and continuing these traditional art forms that are very much making a resurgence today. For many, many years, beadwork, quill work, things like this were thought to be kind of a dying art. They weren't appreciated publicly necessarily. They were relegated to like tourist moccasins at gas stations, right? But we're really fortunate that in recent years, people have been able to kind of recover and restore the vitality of these traditions. And a lot of that is thanks to, the objects we have in collections like this. So we're going to kind of start off at the beginning. What I have on the table here are a few examples of quill work. Now, quill work is something you don't see very often nowadays because it's so incredibly painstaking and delicate. So these are objects that were actually made out of porcupine quills entirely. It's hard to imagine, but this book cover, and you'll see it in the close-up, is entirely made out of these dyed porcupine quills that were stitched onto the leather. It's really quite incredible. I have done this work. I enjoy beading a lot myself. I wouldn't say I'm good at it, but I can make things that look okay. Quill work for me is just above and beyond. I can't even wrap my head around doing it. It's so meticulous, it's so skilled that very few people can really even do it properly nowadays. But back in the 19th century, Indigenous women, even women from Métis families like the Inksters, took these traditional art forms and ran with them and made this incredibly beautiful, floral, vivid work like this. Now, strictly speaking, this isn't the oldest style, right? This isn't the most traditional, but it reminds us a lot of beading. And in many ways, the beadwork designs that we know today evolved out of these quill work designs that were common in the 19th century, and actually probably for hundreds, if not thousands of years before that. Indigenous people were refining and perfecting these techniques to decorate their clothing and to make special objects. These belts back here are a little bit more what we would have seen a long time ago. These particular ones were most likely made by some people from the Dene community. These ones, as far as we know, came from northern Saskatchewan. Now, they are made with much smaller quills than this, incredibly fine, tiny quills that porcupines only have a few of them, right? And you'll see it again in the close-up, but on this belt there are, I'm going to say, at least 1,000 rows of quills, probably 2,000, honestly. And every time the color changes, that's a different quill. So for all of these thousands of quills to make this belt, someone had to trap porcupines or hunt them, harvest the quills by hand, clean them, prepare them, dye them, and then spend hundreds and hundreds of hours basically weaving and sewing them into these incredible belts. They're small, in a way they're simple, but this represents months of work from somebody. So they're incredibly beautiful objects. They don't get shown very often because they're very sensitive to light and they're very, very delicate. But these traditions and these ways of working were kind of taken and then evolved into this more graphic floral kind of style a little bit later. Now, eventually they led us to this beautiful kind of beadwork you can see in the background, but I'm going to save that for last because I have the best story for those. The next piece I'm going to talk about here is this little embroidered pocket. So what this is actually a watch pocket. A man would have kept his pocket watch in this. And I find this super interesting Because now, even in some formal contexts, especially back in the early 20th century, the 19th century, men wore pocket watches to show off. They're gold, they're engraved, they're fancy, they're expensive, and so you leave it hanging kind of out of your pocket, right? But in these Métis families, they didn't show off their watches necessarily, they covered them, they hid them, right? Their wives made these unbelievably beautiful, wonderful little objects and pockets to keep them in. So for me, that's kind of a neat piece of the story. But the designs here are floral. This is a little vase, basically, that has flowers blooming out of it, just like you would have on a dining room table. And I think that you can sort of connect the dots here, right? You see the quill work evolving into these kind of designs. You see this embroidery style, which eventually leads into this beadwork more so. But this piece is very, very old. This one was made before the 1850s. I can't say more specifically than that, but the type of dye and the colors that are used, after the 1850s, they had different chemicals, they could make very different dyes. These kind of earth tones are the sorts of thing you saw in the earlier 19th century. Now, it's embroidered using something they call a double chain stitch, which is a very particular way of embroidering. You see it in China and other places, but it was very popular here in the early days with Métis women, specifically. And it's embroidered on caribou hide, home-tanned, brain-tanned caribou hide. And this is actually a really cool object because it's something that only could have existed here at this time in this place. Now, it is basically a fusion of Indigenous and European styles and techniques and materials, right? A watch pocket is obviously coming out of this European settler tradition, but it's on home-tanned caribou. It uses silk embroidery thread, which is again European, but they're using these obviously indigenous natural designs, right? So it's a really cool and unique thing. Now the reason I say this could only exist here is because of the combination of materials. You cannot do embroidery like this on normal leather. It's impossible. You just can't do it today. The reason for that is partly because the leather is too thick. I wish I could almost take this apart and show you, but there is no thread on the back side of this. This embroidery technique was actually done by sewing only through the top little faint millimeter of the top of the hide. You could just catch your thread in there and do all the embroidery right on the surface so the back was completely smooth. It's not possible to do that on fabric, it just rips. But this special brain tan caribou is one of the only things soft enough and strong enough at the same time to let you do this beautiful work. So it's really above and beyond, it's so tiny, it's so delicate and wonderful. And this probably would have been an object that somebody prized for their entire life, right? It's existed for almost 200 years here in the museum, and it's still really inspiring today. So that embroidery technique is quite interesting because here it was taught in schools. The first schools for girls did not always teach things like writing and math. They taught skills that the Victorians thought were important, like how to raise children, how to sew pretty things for your husband, right? I'm being kind of facetious, but women did not get the kind of education back then that they do today. These are the things they learned in school. And they were taught this double chain stitch style of embroidery in particular. And when you really look at it up close, you're going to notice that it looks very much like the beadwork here. It's these tight little loops that are very much like beads put next together to make the floral designs. And so later, beadwork became a lot more popular. Beading it's wonderful, it's time consuming, it takes hundreds of hours sometimes, but it is like warp speed compared to that quill work, right? You just go buy some fabric, go buy some beads, you stitch them on, you're good to go. It's hard to imagine the work that went into gathering those quills, dyeing those quills, and assembling the work. The beadwork is also a lot more durable, right? The quill work breaks easily. These things are still here over 150 years later. Now, beyond just being really ridiculously beautiful, these cushions have a very special story to them. They were actually made by some of the Inkster women. I think that's really unique. I have mentioned before that women often don't really exist in history, right? Indigenous women, even less so. We have beadwork, the names are never associated with it. We know the name of the man who bought it, maybe, right? Not the woman who made it. These are such a unique departure from that. We don't know exactly which ones, but after doing a lot of research with the Manitoba Museum, consulting with some other experts, we've concluded that these were almost certainly made by women from the Inkster Sinclair family. The Sinclairs have a long and rich tradition of being artists, actually. There are a few Sinclair women whose objects are known to exist in other museum collections. They have a really wonderful bag that was made by basically an aunt of the women who would have made these pillows at the Manitoba Museum. And we have been able to figure out a bit of a family style. You can see things that are common in all the beadwork, and they're represented in these pillows as well as some of the other known pieces. But the thing that you'll notice is that all three of these are very different looking. You might not believe me that they were done by one person, because they weren't. We have concluded that these were probably made as a family project. We know that the Sinclair women were wonderful beadworkers. Mary Sinclair probably learned from her mother, who was a woman named Nahaway Sinclair. She lived here at Seven Oaks House for the last years of her life. And these traditions were passed down from grandmother to mother to daughter, right? They passed down ways of making, and they passed down patterns and styles of making. And so you can kind of start to see a family resemblance or a family tradition in them. And in a neat way, this is almost like a family portrait. What we believe happened here is that three of the Inkster daughters, most likely, maybe even working with their mother, would have learned how to bead, and they would have done this project together. The three cushions are exactly the same size. They are on the same fabric, and they actually use exactly the same type of beads. We can't be sure about a date, but they're the kind of beads that were available maybe in the 1860s, 1870s. So you have these three pillows made basically at the same time, but by different people. So it's a really kind of unique story, and it's really, really cool to be able to check them out and to see the difference in styles. In some ways, these are very traditional Red River Métis beadwork. They're particularly beautiful examples, I think. They have some really, really fine detailed work, and they use, each one of these pillows incorporates about 25 or more different colors. So that says something about the people who made it. They were not out somewhere remote. John Inkster owned a store. If you could just go to Dad's store and have your pick of the bead selection, you could probably make something like this. In other contexts, you sometimes see, more simple colors. So even in those ways, just looking at the materials, just looking at these cushions and a few little fragments of history, we've been able to recreate this really amazing and beautiful story of, a family tradition being passed down. You can almost, still today, picture, the Inkster women sitting out in the garden, surrounded by flowers, making these things together. So it's a wonderful story, and it's the sort of story that we don't often get to tell in a museum like this. So for me, these are some of my favorite objects. Really, really happy to share them with you today.